Hi guys, and welcome back to another IBRACORP video. Thanks for tuning in with us today. Today we're looking at the next episode in our series with the business on open source. And I'm with Brian from the Awesome Open Source channel. I'm going to let Brian introduce himself and then we'll get into the meat of today's video.
Yeah, I'm your open source advocate and we are back with another video, and yeah, I'm excited to get into this one. So I'm going to let you kind of kick it off and I'll just jump in where I feel like I can jump in. I want to say thank you to all of my subscribers and all of my patrons over at Patreon. Seriously, you guys make this so worth it for me to do these videos every week. I really truly enjoy it, and I just can't say thank you enough. If you're enjoying these videos, subscribe. Let YouTube know that I'm doing a good job by subscribing to the channel. Plus, you'll get notified when I have new videos coming out. And finally, if you're enjoying what I'm doing, give it a like. Just click on that thumbs up, and that way YouTube knows that you like it, and they'll pass it along to other people that might enjoy my content as well. I really appreciate it. Thank you again. Let's get started.
Sounds great. Well, look guys, today's topic is about DNS, and it kind of relates to our reverse proxy setups, which basically will mean and explain how we're going to get the applications that are running on our server at home or in your business to be accessible worldwide, maybe to your customers or to yourself, depending on the purpose. Now, that might include some applications that you need to maintain your business, and so you want to be able to access them remotely, but you also want them to be secured. And then you may also have public-facing websites or services that you want customers or people to access, and you either want to restrict those or they're completely unrestricted, as in for public view. How do we go and get that service from our server, which we showed you in the previous episodes, accessible remotely? Now, depending where you are in the world, there are some limitations from your ISP or your network in general that may stop you or prevent you from getting access to that service remotely worldwide. So the first thing we need to talk about is DNS, or the domain name system. And that basically means when you buy a domain, so let's say you bought IBRACORP.com.au, which is the example I'm showing up on our screen currently. I've bought the domain and I have a website that is going to be advertising IBRACORP or whatever it is. How do I get people to access that now? We need to connect the domain name to our server by setting up DNS records, which basically tell your DNS registrar, whoever that may be, or whoever you purchased the domain from. It tells the registrar where to point that domain address to and where it lives. So that when a person types it in, the DNS service will then forward that to the IP address of the server that is hosting the website. So there's a couple ways that we have been discussing on how we're going to show you how to do this. Now, we've extensively covered DNS and reverse proxies and all that stuff in our videos on both channels with Brian and myself. So we didn't want to have to rehash everything, but we will be trying to explain as much as possible so that if you're just coming new to this new series, you understand what's going on and how to utilize it. So Brian, did you have anything you wanted to add as part of the intro to this?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on everything pretty well, but this is a fairly basic video, but at the same time, I think it'll be important because we want people to understand, you need to register a domain name if you want to have access with a domain name, and it can be very inexpensive to fairly expensive depending on the domain name that you want. So getting out there and searching on your registrar is going to be important. But at the same time, once you've got the domain name, knowing how to use that and how to point it back to those services that you want to utilize is going to be very important. And there's different ways that can be accomplished, and it's definitely going to depend, like we've said, on what your ISP is providing you. If you're a business and you're getting a business connection, a lot of times you won't have these barriers in your way. But if you're starting off with more what they would consider a home connection, a lot of times there are some hurdles that you might have to overcome depending on what your ISP delivers to you.
Yeah, so well said, Brian. And basically, guys, so we need to understand how to set this up because we're not going to get anywhere if we can't get people to access our website or if we can't reach our services remotely. Now, one of the biggest traps that you probably may have already been caught in is known as CGNAT or double NAT, and it's known by a few different names, which means your ISP is not giving you a direct dedicated IP address, or they are putting preventions in place to stop you being able to forward certain ports through the network, which is basically, in some cases these days, in my honest opinion, is an ISP basically saying, you know, you're not on a business plan, so we're going to try and restrict you from trying to do business activities on a residential internet connection. That's all well and good, but we have the right to use it. We want to be able to access our stuff remotely without having to be sidelined by the ISP. So there's a couple of different options we can look at. Now, in the world of open source and free, it's going to be hard to balance that out, and there are a couple of different options you can go for. One way we can do this is using something like Cloudflare. Now, if you don't know what Cloudflare is, it is a, how would you describe it, Brian? It is a DNS server that will allow you to forward your IP address out, and it actually will cache them onto different servers across the world, and those IP addresses are then sent off to the end user. So as you can see in the image I'm showing here, which is from our Cloudflare CDN video, we've already explained in that video how to set it up, purchase a domain, and get NGinX Proxy Manager going, for example. And Brian's done the same on his channel with NGinX Proxy Manager and understanding reverse proxies. But basically, let's say down here, our IP address for our house, if we had a dedicated IP or not, let's say that's our IP address. And we have our server here that we just built, our Proxmox server, whatever the case is. That connection needs to get out and get to the end user who's typing in the domain name here. If we're not forwarding the ports, it's not going to get anywhere. It basically gets stopped right here at this point. We won't be able to get past our own home connection or out to the DNS service. If your ports are not blocked, then you will at least be able to reach Cloudflare, and then from Cloudflare, it will then present a proxied IP address, as they like to call it, which means the IP address that results on the end user side is different to the origin IP address, which helps protect your privacy and secure the connection. It will also present SSL certificates for you on the edge side of things, and you can also generate Cloudflare certificates for the origin. So that way, the entire chain is secured with SSL encryption. Now, if we can't, for whatever reason, open up two very important ports, which is port 80 and port 443, known as the HTTP and the HTTPS protocols. Those two ports are basically essential to reverse proxy websites, or to get websites up and running. Typically, those two are the ones that will be open. However, like I said, ISPs will tend to block those, try to prevent you from using those ports to open things up. Well, that's perfectly fine. We have other options to get our services out to the world or to ourselves. One of those options is using something called Cloudflare Tunnels, which we also done a video on. And what that will do is make a direct connection with Cloudflare without having to open up any ports, and allow Cloudflare to then reverse proxy our content out to the world for us. So we don't have to worry about that blocked by the ISP. Another option is using things like VPNs. And I'll let Brian probably explain a little bit about VPNs, because we might have a bit more of the open source options out there that we can use to do so.
So when you do have either CGNAT, the double NAT, where you're kind of behind two different sets of IP addresses, it almost becomes, you know, it's not impossible, but it becomes very hard for you to open up any ports that you need, because you're not in control of both of the endpoints that are providing you access to the internet. So one of the things you can do is basically create a tunnel with a VPN connection, so a virtual private network. And there's some really great open source tools for that. So OpenVPN's been around forever. It's super steady. It's super great for doing things like this. But also there's a newer protocol that's been around for a few years, and it's called Wireguard. And if you haven't heard of it, it is just absolutely amazing. I've got multiple videos on Wireguard. There's tons of YouTube videos on Wireguard out there. And now there's starting to be a lot of services that help you get things set up in a little bit easier way. It was very manual and you know, configuration file based, but still not too difficult to understand once you kind of wrap your mind around it. But you're basically making a point-to-point connection from inside of your network. And the reason they call it a tunnel is that you reach out from inside your network. You're basically punching a hole out from your network to a cloud service like Cloudflare, and Cloudflare offers something like this called an Argo Tunnel. But you can also run it yourself with something like Wireguard on a VPS, where you set up a little cheap DigitalOcean $6 a month VPS, or a Linode $5 a month VPS, or maybe even like an Oracle free tier virtual private server. So you reach out from inside your network to that server, and that server then acts as your proxy. So you can set up these services that you want to run inside your network, and then that server that's out there just says, hey, I saw this request for this IBRACORP.com, and you've told me that needs to go to this inside your network, and since I'm a VPN, I've got a private direct connection right into there, so I'm just going to go ahead and forward that request on, and then the person who typed it in on the browser sees your website come up, and it's all encrypted. It's all very, very handy. It's really just a great way to do things. Even if you have actually access to open up ports and forward ports and do things, sometimes this is a little bit more of a secure way, I guess, because you're actually not creating any holes in your firewall going in from the outside. You're actually just reaching out from inside your network and saying, hey, you can, through this secure tunnel, you can provide this service. So it's quite a few ways that you can do that, but some really great services out there that are open source that can help you do that. So if you don't have the ability to open ports and forward ports on your firewall to come through to your servers, it's not the end of the world. There are other ways to do it, and we'll probably cover those as we go forward in the series in a little bit more detail. But we both have videos on how to do these things, and the IBRACORP channel has a good video on Argo Tunnels already that'll help you get started if you want to kind of check that out. It's a Cloudflare service, and if you want to see some open source options, I have some plans to have some other open source project creators come on and help us kind of see what we can do with some of their projects as well. So I'm excited about that part. But yeah, there's definitely options.
Absolutely. So, I mean, the initial step is obviously you've bought your domain name. Now, a lot of people have a little bit of a struggle when they're thinking about buying a domain and how much it may cost. Obviously, depending on the domain name and the top level domain ending, whether it's .com or .io or whatever the case might be, the price might be different. But honestly, you guys, you can pick up a domain pretty cheap and register it for a few years and not have to worry about it. And it's always going to be there for you to use. And you can expand it so much. So you don't have to buy like 10 domains. You just buy the one and have a bunch of different subdomains, for different things you want to use it for. Especially if it's public facing, you might want to separate your personal stuff and your business stuff. So make sure you have one just for your business related activity, because if you have a public facing website with private links, might get into a bit of trouble there safety wise. But the process is basically purchase a domain. Someone like Google offers domain registration, GoDaddy, things like that. One thing to watch out for, and a tip that I could give you, is when you're purchasing a domain though, double check what you're allowed to do with that registrar. For example, I think if my memory serves me correct, GoDaddy will not allow you to set up DNSSEC, which is important for securing your domain on the DNS level and the registrar level, whereas Google Domains does. At that point, you can then decide whether you want to use them as the DNS provider or use a different organization as the DNS provider. So you don't have to do everything with Cloudflare. You don't have to do everything with Google. You don't have to do everything with GoDaddy. Your domain registrar can be completely separate to the DNS provider if you so choose. So in our case, we've purchased the domain, for example, on Google. In Google, I've basically just said to it, I don't want you to use any of your Google DNS. I want you to use Cloudflare. I've then set it up in Cloudflare, and Cloudflare is handling all of our DNS related activity.
I'll just say that Cloudflare does have some incredible tools built in for DNS. I mean, their whole thing is security. They make money by selling the ability to use these services. So there is a free level that you can kind of start off with. But as you get into it more, you might look at it and say, you know what, this is worth it for me to pay for this. This is worth it for me to get these extra paid services. When you're starting a business, I don't want to tell you that you need to plan to have $10,000 up front. If you're starting a business where you could do everything for free, that's great. I would say that if you're planning to start a business to try to actually make money, it's probably a good idea to plan to have a little bit of investment capital up front, because there are going to be things that you need to buy. You need to buy the domain name. If it's $4.99, that's $5. Okay, great. You got a domain name. Make sure it's a domain name that makes sense. Make sure it's not a domain name that's really hard for people to remember. And like we've said, make sure that you have control over your DNS from your registrar, because there are registrars out there who will sell you the domain and then they want you to use their hosting, so you can't actually change the DNS side of it.
Yeah, definitely. You want to make sure that you're factoring in a few things, and it's an important step. Like, it's easier for you to overlook it and think about just the money side of things, but if you're not going to invest at least $5 for a domain, we're not off to a good start in terms of getting a business up and running, because the customer doesn't want to go to a website with a Proton mail address or anything like that. You want to seem professional. It's not hard. They make it seem hard. $5 to buy a domain and look professional is fantastic. And the other thing is, later on, you're going to be using that same domain for things like mail. You can do that with free options as well. There's plenty of ways to do it, but you'll have a professional email address, which is critical when we're talking about business. And as you can see here, this is the Google Domains page. As part of the video, I was just showing how to purchase one, if you wanted to purchase one. And then here we get to the Cloudflare side of things. And as Brian was saying, you can pay for features in Cloudflare. It has always been free. There's always a free tier here. I've had some people say I couldn't find the free tier. It's always there. It sometimes might be a little bit hard to find because they might want you to pay, but there's always a free one there. And I can tell you, I've got about 15 domains with Cloudflare. I've never purchased anything. I've always been on the free plan, and it's done everything I needed to. Let's hope they don't change that. But anyway, guys, just to be clear, we're not paid by Cloudflare or anything. I'm just giving you an option that I use personally from personal experience. And there's other options out there, so you don't have to use it. I'm just trying to give you some personal experience on that one.
Well, I'll say that Cloudflare has tools that people want and that people like. They have tools that people want to use, because as much as we love open source, as much as I love open source, when there's a provider that has tools that are so useful that people constantly go out and say, is there an open source alternative to this? That tells me that it's a super useful service with a lot of great tools. That tells me that I definitely should be looking at them. And yes, if there's an open source alternative that gives me what they give me, I might want to look at it and see if I want to do that. But if there's not, then at the time, that may be the service that you should be looking to use. It's probably going to help save you a lot of headaches and effort. And especially, again, when you're running a professional level business, and if you want your business to grow, having a lot of this security and protection that things like Cloudflare can offer through all the different services they provide for your DNS stuff becomes more and more important. The bigger you get, the more you become a target for people. So kind of keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, exactly right. And here you can see the dashboard for Cloudflare, which will be the same on any other DNS provider that you choose, or very similar at least. But what you're seeing here is, this is our domain name that we purchased, and yours will be there. And the content is where we're going to be pointing it to, which will usually have the IP address. For the purpose of that video, I think I blacked it out or whited it out just so we kept the IP address private. But you would have the IP address here. So then Cloudflare will say IBRACORP.org points to 192.75, whatever your global IP address is. Now, for those trying to get away using a free setup, a lot of people use DuckDNS and go through that whole rigmarole of using a free DNS provider to then forward it to your IP address. Honestly, with all the time that you'll spend maintaining that, and again, personal preference, whatever you choose, I would still rather just buy a domain name and register it this way. It's just easier to maintain, and it's going to be less overhead worrying about third parties managing our domain name. And then obviously we then have a CNAME that we're adding to say, let's say IBRACORP.org is our main domain. If you go to that, it's all about our business, about IBRACORP. But then we wanted a page just for support tickets, for example. You might want to have a CNAME called support, which then points to IBRACORP.org. Now what that will say is then support.IBRACORP.org takes you to the support page. So that's one way that you can really expand the use of your domain name as well, trying to get a lot of use out of it instead of just one purpose for one particular thing. In fact, you can point it at different servers. If you have, if I have a server here and we have a server at Brian's house and we want support.ibracorp.org to actually point to a server at Brian's house or Brian's business, we can do that as well, which again gives you a bit of flexibility.
So there's lots of different types of records that you can set up in DNS, and the important ones are for now are really the A record, which you can see there. So he's kind of got his base A record set up. He said IBRACORP.org points to his IP address where he's running that server. The next one is that CNAME. The CNAME means I'm going to give this like a secondary name. So it's a subdomain. So he's setting up support.ibracorp.org. So that's support. And then he says, point that to the same server as ibracorp.org. And this is a super, super powerful thing in DNS. It doesn't matter which registrar you go with. If you have a whole bunch of services that you're running on different subdomains running off the same Proxmox server, you want to set up that base domain so that it points to your IP address wherever that server is running. And then you want to set up CNAMEs. Because when if you have an IP address that changes, or if at some point that IP address changes and you've got 100 subdomains, you don't want to go change 100 A records. You want to go change that base A record, and then all of those CNAMEs already pointed to that base record. So when you change it, they all get changed at the same time. So you're not down for an hour and a half updating a bunch of IP addresses, or maybe 2 days, because the DNS system takes, 48 hours to update sometimes. So CNAME is a super powerful thing, and understanding what that's for, I think, is really important when you're kind of getting into setting up a business and making sure you've got things set up correctly.
It's really flexible, guys. It's really flexible. I mean, in one of my domains, I have one address going to one server, then 10 CNAMEs that might point to that address, but then I might have a separate CNAME that actually points somewhere completely different, and then getting other CNAMEs pointing to that CNAME. So you can make it as complicated as you like or as simple as you like, but it gives you that flexibility, which is great. And you've also got MX records, which we will get to when we talk about setting up, your business email. So we won't touch on that too much, I think, in today's video, but just so you're aware, that's for our mail server.
So I think you touched on it lightly, talking about DuckDNS and dynamic DNS. One thing, again, we don't work for Cloudflare. We don't get any special offers from Cloudflare that I'm aware of. So I'm just saying, Cloudflare does have a dynamic DNS service, which means you can, again, register your domain with Cloudflare, and then you run basically a container, a Docker container inside of your network, and it says, what's my public IP right now? It checks every 5 minutes, and then it says, hey, if it changes, it goes and it uses an API with Cloudflare to update the IP address for your A record at Cloudflare, which keeps everything pointing to where it needs to be with minimal downtime. Now, you're going to have that 5 minutes where it could have changed. You're going to have anywhere from 10 minutes to 24 hours where the IP changes and DNS needs to update. So depending on how often your IP address is updating, dynamic DNS still may not be the best bet. But if it's the only thing you've got and you need to start with that, just know that there are options, and it's not just Cloudflare. GoDaddy has it, Hover has it. I mean, I think a bunch of the registrars have dynamic DNS service. Just getting them set up may be a little bit different process in each thing. So it's valuable to know that. I just wanted to kind of touch on that one too, because dynamic DNS is a thing, and it can be useful if you have a dynamic IP. Most of the time, if you get a business level ISP account, they'll give you a static IP too.
Definitely, and that probably takes us on to the next one, which I'll just quickly bring up. So just touching on what Brian's just mentioned about dynamic DNS, that is also something that can present a little bit of a challenge when we're talking about our IP address staying the same, or if our ports are being blocked by our ISP, which takes us back to something like the Cloudflare tunnel. It used to be Argo Tunnels. That's now a separate product, so ignore a little bit of the terminology, but Cloudflare Tunnels, basically what we're saying is it's going to connect us to our DNS server directly, and then the Argo service is what connects us out to the world. So as you can see, here's our setup here. Here's our server, Proxmox server. We might have our 3 VMs running in here and our reverse proxy, which we'll cover later. The tunnel will just directly connect us straight through the firewall, through the router, and out to the Argo service, giving us our DNS entries and requests, which we're able to then access from anywhere in the world. That means we're completely bypassing the ISP's blocks or any other barrier to entry. That also includes an IP address that might be changing all the time. So when we're using something like the tunnel or VPNs, we don't have to worry about our IP address changing, which a lot of people do face. The ISP does not offer you a static IP address by default in a lot of cases. and they might ask you that, you need to pay to get a static IP address. So this takes you completely out of that ecosystem. So when we're talking about free and open source, sometimes we might be able to accomplish the free side of things and not necessarily open source side of things. In which case, I still think it's a better option than paying my ISP however much to just get a static IP address. If they offer it to you for free, by all means, of course, take that opportunity if you can. But
absolutely,
yeah, definitely take that opportunity if you can. But otherwise, if you can't you can't afford it, whatever the case might be, the tunnel's free. So why wouldn't you use it?
And there are some open source tunnels. So again, I've got a video I'm working on now about one that just came out. It's got a little bit of a rough edge around it, so I'm not sure we'd want to use it specifically for this purpose today. But I think give the developer a couple of months and it's going to be well-rounded, and it's pretty easy to set up if you just have like a VPS somewhere. So again, a little bit of investment money, $5 a month for a VPS to cut around all of this kind of stuff that we're talking about is probably worth it. But again, if you're saying, you know what, I don't have $5 a month to start, then Cloudflare's got a free option that you can use as well.
Just to be clear, I'm only showing you guys this just as an example of how a tunnel would work as well. We're not saying you have to go with Cloudflare. We're just giving you an example of how the tunnels actually work. So we would love to then present you with some more open source ones. So Brian, definitely looking forward to seeing an open source option in that sense.
Yeah, and I think when we get, I'm not sure, so don't quote me on this, but the NetMaker stuff I think is going to give us some other options too. So that's going to be good. I'm excited about that one.
Absolutely. And as you can see in this video, we did talk about it a little bit more, but as we start to go along the line, we're ticking off some of the layers that we drew out. This is typically the path in which your requests will be going through. Okay, and you also open yourself up to a little bit of risk. With the tunnel, we're not opening up ports. We're not having to worry about opening up vulnerabilities in our router. It's all encrypted connection out. So guys, that's DNS overview and talking about all the different terminologies and technologies that we can use to try and accomplish DNS. Like we said, we have covered them in very good detail in many of our previous videos that still stand up today and nothing has changed. So we would ask you to check those. We'll make sure we drop them in the description below. And if you had any questions, be sure to ask us in the comments. We'd love to answer them. Sometimes things do change. Maybe you're just not quite sure on how something may work. Be sure to drop it in a comment and we'd love to get back to you on that. With that said, I think that's it for today's video. That should hopefully get us ready for the next step in getting some applications up and running related to our business on open source. Honestly, it's the most exciting part of this whole project and we've been waiting to get to that. Without further ado, we're going to leave it there. Thanks guys, we hope you enjoyed and we'll see you in the next IBRACORP and awesome open source video.